Hi, everyone, and thanks for joining us for the 7th episode of the Albums Only podcast. My name is Alan Beavers, and alongside me, as always, is Jacob Slater. And today we are going to talk about Portishead, a very well-known band in alternative circles in the 1990s. They're a big part of the trip-hop movement. They didn't invent it, but they were huge progenitors of it in many ways, alongside Massive Attack and bands like Tricky. Jacob, your thoughts on Portishead and their legacy and their sound, really?
Portishead, obviously, as you mentioned, a member of the trip-hop community, which refers to a style of electronic music which fused electronic influences and hip-hop influences. Kind of came out of the acid house movement of the early 90s. Incorporated a lot of, obviously, soul, jazz, funk elements in such a way as to kind of make them indistinguishable from each other. I guess you could also consider it a kind of subgenre of ambient music as a whole.
That's an interesting way to think about it. Yeah, I don't know. I think, when I think about trip-hop, I kind of, again, sort of like the hip-hop beats, and I always think about, you mentioned ambient music, and I guess this is sort of the place where they meet, is the IDM movement, the intelligent dance music movement, which, terrible name, let's be honest, to have a genre called IDM, intelligent, as if there's such a thing, as if you could dance intelligently. But bands like Boards of Canada, they take that sort of hip-hop beats and sort of play with them in such a way to create sort of a childhood nostalgia. And trip-hop isn't quite that, but it's kind of becomes down-tempo. It sort of becomes reflective. It's still reflective, but not quite nostalgia,
It is definitely a type of music which, like ambient music in general, kind of is meant more to create a mood rather than to, say, like in the works of Leonard Cohen, for example, to tell a story or to kind of explore a specific theme. It's definitely type of music which sets a mood. Portishead, obviously one of the big progenitors of that subgenre. A band that really up until I listened to this album for this podcast, I had never listened to them. They were a band that I kind of, in my youth, pushed aside in this kind of same late 90s category. It was music that was known to me as a youth during that time, bands like Bjork and Radiohead, Nine Inch Nails, but for whatever reason, I kind of was not interested in them for whatever reason, even though as a teenager I was big into bands like Primus and Nick Cave and the Bad Seeds and the Gorillaz. For whatever reason, I figured out while I was listening to this album why it was that I had never listened to Portishead before. It all sprung from this episode of Mad TV I had watched years and years ago, back when Mad TV was on Comedy Central. And there was a musical group on the show called Corky and the Juice Pigs, which were a pretty good band. And they had a song where they were kind of jumping in between various musical styles. Portishead was one of those bands. What they presented as Portishead seemed like something, like, what is this music? I'd
Right.
never want to listen to this music. And it kind of, I guess, stuck in my head subconsciously, and I never kind of returned to it. Like, I got a bit of Nine Inch Nails later on, got a little bit of Radiohead, really liked the Bends. For whatever reason, like, I took a while for me to listen to Bjork too, and Mad TV also made fun of Bjork. Alex Borstein, better known as
Yes,
Lois,
that makes
from
sense.
Family Guy,
Yeah.
she performed as Bjork on the show, and both Portishead and Bjork were artists that it took at least until I got to U92 to even explore, because I guess I just had this mental block in my head against these bands.
Well, it's interesting. Like, I can imagine, it's got to be easy to make fun of Bjork, with the whole swan gown. I don't know if people remember this, but was it in the late...
Like weird, she's like
Yeah.
Scandinavian.
Yeah, Icelandic, right? I think she's Icelandic.
Yeah.
And she's, I think to some award ceremony or some function in the late 90s, early 2000s, she wore like a swan, like it's like a full, like, I don't know if it was like a duck or a goose or a swan, but it was just a very odd choice. But I mean, that's Bjork, does those sorts of things. So I can't imagine it's hard to poke a little fun at Bjork with, with everything else there. But it's interesting because that's one of the big questions that we always ask that, you and I go back and forth on often is, when did you first hear a band? That's interesting because that's the first case where we really have a negative stereotype or a negative reaction that prevented you from checking it out. I don't remember when I first heard Portishead or heard of them. I remember not liking them as much as I probably wanted to at the time, given how critically lauded they were. So yeah, it's fascinating to me that they are so well loved, and it makes sense now looking back on it. You go back to 1994 and their first release, 1994's Dummy. It's got some big tracks on there that are well known in the alternative rock scene. You've got Glory Box on there, which is a big one, which people have heard in many movies. Even if you don't know what it is, as soon as you hear it, you'll probably know that you've heard it from somewhere before. And then the other one there that I really love is called Sour Times. I think it's the second track on the album. And it's like a James Bond theme. It's beautiful. It's just gorgeous. It flows so well. And Beth Gibbons' voice is just perfect on it. It's just so complimentary. Your thoughts on sort of their introductory phase?
I had not listened, and really I was too young when they were at their heyday to kind of get into the band. It was a really good time for electronic music and like house music and everything, the 1990s. And not just Portishead introducing trip hop, but obviously, Massive Attack. The Prodigy was very good. David Bowie had his turn with electronic music with Earthling. A very dance-heavy, electronica-heavy decade, really, especially in the later half of the 90s. And so if you were going to do anything in the 90s, really, was try experimenting with electronic music. I mean, Beck did it, Beastie Boys did it.
Yeah, and I think Beck's a good example here. You really hear in Portishead, especially it's Portishead's second album, 1997's self-titled release, their eponymous release, which is really interesting. Generally, that comes first, right? Like generally, your eponymous title is your first album because it sort of sets you to a sound. And if there's an exception to that, it's that there's been some refinement in your sound and you need to relabel yourself, so you sort of you've never done an eponymous release before, so now you're going to do it and say, okay, now this is our sound. That could come 3, 4, 5 albums in. Interpol's a good example of someone who's done that. But 1997 and Portishead, the album Portishead, an expansion of that sound, it reminded me a lot of Beck, of sort of that mellow gold, Odelay, kind of take everything, sample everything, some scratching, a lot of different things going on there. Did you have anything else that you wanted to add about Portishead's first 2 albums before we go on to third?
Not really. I mean, obviously it is definitely important to note that if you're going to be looking into Portishead, you might, after listening to us talk about this album, Portishead really makes artistic leaps from their first 2 albums onto this one. And obviously there's a big leap in terms of time, over a decade between their last album and third. But, it's also very different musically. Portishead's third, I think the one thing you're going to hear a lot about this album from us is that it's not really what you'd expect from trip hop. I think it definitely captures a kind of tone, like an ambient tone, but it is definitely a distinct leap. And Portishead's third is like a whole different album than the Portishead sound that they had built up in the 90s.
And that's a great point. And I think that's the thing that should be noted here. In making this album, what's fascinating to me is they made it a point to not do the sort of tricks and sounds that they had done previously. And that's what's really fascinating here is you're hearing, it's so much darker, but you're not hearing a lot of that same like trip hop sort of down tempo. This feels like an album on edge. It feels, there's still elements of trip hop there, right? There's still a heavy rhythmic emphasis, but it feels disjointed often. It feels clattering. It feels like it's about to go off the rails often, which reminds me of Radiohead at their best. That sort of paranoia that it just sort of infiltrates the record. It's really hard to do, and it's a thing too that a lot of people, in my experience, have a problem appreciating. They have a hard time getting inside the music and sort of enjoying that sort of paranoia, that on edge, that anxiousness For me, that's a lot of fun. I don't know about you, but that's so fascinating to me. And I think people who aren't comfortable with sort of that emotion, that sort of what's often considered negative emotion, they're probably not going to enjoy this as much as they could.
And that's really kind of puts Portishead in kind of that grouping of like bands that kind of hit their stride in the late 90s of music that kind of invoked more negative emotions than positive emotions. You could say it got started all the way back in punk music of the late 70s, but in the 90s you had Nirvana and Pearl Jam, like all these grunge bands. Even though musically, Radiohead and Nine Inch Nails and Portishead were leagues different, it was still kind of a cultural mindset. There was still this kind of culture of not really reveling in negativity, but kind of not putting like a happy face on things. Stuff is bad, so we're going to say it's bad.
Right. Well, I think, and too, I mean, again, I think that's reflected even into the late 90s, into Radiohead, the sort of paranoia about the digital age, about modern music, and tracks like Fitter Happier of Radiohead. There's that note, sort of a pig in a cage on antibiotics. It's sort of a throwback to the grunge era. That's a very grungy statement, almost. You can imagine Scott Weiland, jamming out with Stone Temple Pilots and having that as a, chorus in some form or fashion. But yeah, no, I agree. I think that's the really fascinating thing. So in a way, it's sort of a continuation of that tradition.
So that's a great point to take us into the album Third, released in 2008. Sort of out of nowhere, Portishead decided that they were going to release another album, and this is it, 2008's Third. There are also a couple other interesting bands that have chosen to name their third album Third. The Soft Machine comes to mind. And then there's another one also you had mentioned that I forgot. Who is it?
Big Star.
Big Star, yes. Another well-respected band.
And if you look at the Wikipedia disambiguation page for Third, Portishead's Third is the third album
that's
on that page.
That is some meta stuff right there, man.
Pretty good company, honestly. Big Star and the Soft Machine.
Absolutely.
Both bands that I think we'll probably cover at some point in the future. They're definitely worth talking about. But yeah, Portishead's Third, released in 2008, released on Island Records in the UK and Mercury Records in the US.
Island Records, great legacy. You want to talk about a great record label?
And, some of Tom Waits' best albums come out on
Tom Waits,
Island.
U2.
I think it's like a really kind of great, I wouldn't say alternative label, but kind of one of the lesser labels almost.
One of the respected, almost more mainstream labels to me. They've had some bigger artists on there, but that also had that respectability among critics, which is, who can complain about that?
I think we should mention that this is the first album that we've done a podcast on that is by a band.
That's a great point. I didn't even realize this. I can't believe that you brought this up, because this is a good point. And I forgot all about keeping an eye on this, but that's interesting. We're our 7th podcast in, and this is the first time we're actually talking about a band.
We didn't plan it, obviously. Well, we did plan it to some degree because we're recording it.
Sure.
But had I had the foresight to be this is what band do I want to be the first band to do an album podcast on? Portishead would probably not have been the first band that I thought of. So you can thank the random number generator for that one.
And I think this is one that I really wanted to cover, because I we go back and forth, and a lot of times we sort of compromise somewhat on who we want, or, you'll list off who you really like to cover, and then I'll say, well, what if we do this album? I like that. I like that we sort of compromise there, because generally you'll throw out a band or an idea, and I'll say, well, what if we do this album? And then sometimes there are times when you push back, but I like that, how we do that. And I think one of the things we're finding out as we do this is it's great to talk about the classic albums, like the utter stone cold classics. It's great to talk about those. However, some of the lesser knowns, and then also we're going to cover some albums that we feel have not gotten their fair shake at some point too. So this is really, for us, this is a lot of fun, and I hope it's fun for the listeners too. It's not always going to be these great albums that, if you go on pitchfork.com, you can find a lot of stuff about how well received the album is, and you can find videos put together that sort of document how great the class, quote unquote classics are. We also want to take some time and cover some of the lesser known and more misunderstood albums, because they're really fascinating as well, and you really deserve to give them a fair shake, because some of them don't have one, and we'll get to that later. That's a bit of a teaser for future episodes. But Portishead, yeah, who would have thought this would be the first band that we would cover?
The group itself, made up of Beth Gibbons, Jeff Barrow, and Adrian Utley. Beth Gibbons obviously being the vocalist you'll hear throughout the record. Jeff Barrow playing drums, and also really kind of the main creative force, it seems like, if you look over the kind of background of it. I think it's important to note that it is kind of a very different thing to kind of return to a group after a decade for the listener and also for the performer. Obviously, I mentioned earlier that Third differs dramatically from Portishead's earlier two albums, and I think that really kind of speaks to Jeff Barrow as a artist and a creator. That obviously it could have been that he didn't work on an album at all, that he didn't need to really do anything. He kind of already cemented a legacy. Or the band itself really had cemented a legacy with their first two albums, that they didn't really need to. And it kind of seems a bit strange that after 10 years they kind of go back to it. Me and Bees kind of were talking about this a while ago, that it's really kind of a conflict between art as kind of a consumable product versus art as a self-expression. It's kind of, we're used to bands that kind of put out records every couple of years. They're kind of like a constant thing. And you don't really see all too often bands that would take even half the time between albums that Portishead would. Obviously, the big examples, My Bloody Valentine, Mazzy Star released an album after 25 years a couple years back. Swans came back after over a decade.
Slow Dive, another wonderful band, and that's another great catalog that one day we will get to. But yeah, there are lots of great examples of bands, taking time, especially from the 90s, that weren't appreciated and really were appreciated more as time went on. And then they come back and then they're given almost their proper due. And a lot of times they return and they're still doing their thing, and it still sounds really, really good.
After so many years, I guess you got to question, like, why do they come back? It's really kind of because they still have things they want to explore musically. It's really kind of an artistic thing that you kind of have to give the artist the time they need to some degree to create. Because I think that's a problem with a lot of bands, that, they'll have a string of like great albums. Like Velvet Underground, they had like their first album, great. White Light, White Heat, great. Now Velvet Underground, great. And Loaded, great. And then like the entire history of that band is like sum up in 4 albums spread out over like 5 years. And like 5 years later, they're just like, they quit. They've grown sick of each other. They can't do it anymore. So if it takes a while you can either let an artist kind of build up the desire and the drive to create again, or you just kind of let them burn themselves out.
And hopefully they have the means with which, particularly the financial means with which, to have that sort of freedom. I think that's the other thing too, right? You have talented bands out there that, though, they have to pump something out every 2 to 3 years, and they have to tour, and that takes its toll, and they don't have time to recuperate, or they don't have time for that, the creative juices to flow, and that can be a problem, I think. But I think that's another issue that crops up. That being said, let's go ahead and actually jump into Third. The first track here, it gets us started right away, is a track called Silence. And if there's one word that I can use to describe this track and the album in general, but again, I love warbly. This is sort of just, there's an anxiousness that permeates the whole thing, but this is sort of a warbly, it's upbeat. Your thoughts actually on the track, Jacob?
It opens really kind of in a classic electronica way. You got like the opening with like some dude speaking Portuguese, Like, I don't know, that kind of idea of like sampling like people talking, is always very kind of classic electronic music to me. Always brings to mind like bands like Ministry or something like
Primal
that.
Scream, maybe. I mean, that's in like more,
Yeah.
industrial, but like of that time, I think of Primal Scream. I can think of some other stuff, but I think for like popular electronica, that's an interesting parallel to draw. I mean, that's not unreasonable for sure. Yeah.
And then he like gets into like a little bit of like a 80s post-punk bass groove going on. But then like the cello and the violin coming in, I think it kind of like, I hadn't listened to Portishead before that, but it kind of like seems to me like you're setting up how things are different. Like you have like trip-hoppy, electronic stuff, but then like, well, wait a minute, we're bringing in strings and everything. We're expanding our sound now.
There is that. I think that's the fascinating thing. This is one of those tracks where you do hear a bit of that. I think just because of the tempo, you get a bit of that trip hop going on. You get the drums. You get the kind of a little bit of that going on. But you can clearly tell this is not the same beast. That this is going to sound different. From there we go on to Hunter. And Hunter, this one is a good one to me. I really like this track. This almost feels magical. I don't even know how to describe this. It's sort of like, I don't know if this is a really good parallel, but to me it is in my mind. This almost feels like it could fit in a Guillermo del Toro film. It's like dark, and it's fun to listen to at night when you're driving. This is one of those ones that's just great. It's dark and sort of mystical and magical as Gibbons is singing, and then all of a sudden it builds. There's this suspense, like something is going to happen. Like something is going to happen, and then the swell goes away, and it sort of builds back up from there. And it works so beautifully. It's one of the highlights of the album, I think.
I kind of labeled it in my notes as something of like almost like a psych folk song in the beginning, something like you'd hear from like Nick Drake or Robert Wyatt, something like very kind of trippy and strange that obviously then kind of descends into madness, I guess you could say.
I don't think that's unfair, but I do like, it takes a deft hand to do that and then pull it back out again to go right back into like sort of the original aspect of the song, and then to pull it back into Paranoia, and then to pull it out and sort of just play around in that. That's a lot of fun to me to be able to do that. I think they do it really well on that one. So from there we move on to Nylon Smile. This is interesting. It sort of begins with these very high scratchy guitar notes, and then it sort of goes into sort of a whirling sort of pattern. It really continues the anxiousness. It really feels, to me, this feels claustrophobic in the best way possible, right?
I don't know how they're kind of creating it, but it almost sounds like they're playing audio in reverse on this song, which I think kind of like adds to this kind of disorientation.
Yes,
I think.
yes. There's I don't know if it is backmasking, if they really do backmask, which is the process of playing a track that you've recorded backwards. I don't know if that's the case. It may not, but you're right. It feels that way. It feels disorienting, and I wouldn't be surprised if that's the case.
And I think this is one of those songs where, a bit like Hunter, has like this kind of Middle Eastern kind of quality to the music. Something about the drums, maybe something about the way they kind of use the instruments, but definitely kind of has this kind of Arabian quality to the music.
Not unlike what we covered before with Black Star. We mentioned that with David Bowie, kind of felt that same way. And again, I agree with you. It kind of comes up here. Nylon Smile. I think it's important here, I guess is a good place as any, to sort of insert Beth Gibbons' vocals. They're paranoid. They're longing. At one point she says, "I don't know what I've done to deserve you, and I don't know what I'll do without you," is also what she says. And there's this sort of just existential dread almost that permeates not only her lyrics but the song. They complement each other so well. It's just fascinating to me.
Beth Gibbons' voice is really kind of the one instrument that kind of permeates throughout the entire album. It really kind of, half of it is like the lyrics that are being sung, and the other half is the way they're being sung. that Beth Gibbons kind of imparts this kind of anxiety and this kind of dark beauty into the music of Third, much in the same way that Tom York of Radiohead, kind of both of their music can be kind of described as this kind of maybe depressing, maybe kind of anxious, at the same time beautiful in its damaged quality.
Yeah,
I guess
that's a great way to put it. And speaking of beautiful in its damaged quality, The Rip is the next track, the fourth track on the album. This is a great track. This was, if there was, you could say, a single off the album, this is it. This is the one that was probably played the most on radio, the most well-known. It starts with this acoustic guitar and Gibbons' voice. Sort of moves on from there and sort of soars at points and really hits nice on the synths. It's a gorgeous song, and it progresses so perfectly. Gibbons, too, makes allusions to white horses, of course, a mystical connotation relating to death. Not surprising that you're going to hear that on this album, but it's just, again, creates that vibe. Again, you see the lyrics and the instruments working so beautifully together. This builds up into a nice little workup at the end. It's a gorgeous song.
You can definitely see why the song would be quite popular. I believe you mentioned when we were talking earlier, Beaves, prior to recording, that it was kind of the big song off the record, and you can definitely see why, because it's kind of a very simple song, but it's also it's very kind of quiet. You got electronic music, but it's not the dance music that we're kind of familiar with electronic music. You got the acoustic stuff going. You got Beth Gibbons kind of doing this folk song. It's a very kind of chill song, so I can see why it would be popular. It'd be something you'd kind of break out at a party or something. Like you got some dude with a guitar. He's gonna pull out this song. You're gonna do the rip.
Oh yeah, you could totally. I would love to hear some covers of that. I think some covers of the Rip would be really interesting. I think you could have a lot of fun with that. I think artists could really do a great job of making it their own. So it's just a killer track, and then we move on from there to the fifth track, Plastic. Now this one, again, this one to me feels the most like a mood setter. It has this sort of warbling, when we discussed it previously, I think you called it almost like a fan, like an oscillating sound that is just there's something so full of doom about it. I understand I'm saying that a lot and putting that sort of atmosphere out there, but just struck by how every track sounds different, but fits together so well on this album. Plastics just continues that trend.
Yeah, and I think part of that kind of cohesion is, as I said, Beth Gibbons' voice kind of always kind of carries this kind of continuing emotion. Compared to The Rip, which was kind of a very clean song, you had some electronic stuff at the end, but it was kind of slow, kind of traditional finger-picking guitar. Plastic kind of sounds as artificial as Plastic actually is. You got this oscillating, almost helicopter-like sound going on. You got this harshly cut drum sample kind of as the rhythm, combined with Beth's vocals. It's a very kind of harsh, strange song.
You have a very Benjamin from The Graduate view of Plastics, which I like. I think that it just carries on the mood. And then speaking of carrying, it goes into the next track, We Carry On. And this is just built on the rhythm of the drums, and it just builds an anxiousness. And I think I mentioned this to you previously. This feels like a chase scene in a horror film, or even a psychological thriller. This comes on, you're looking behind your shoulder because something is coming after you. It's one of those things that just continues to build, and it's like, oh no, I think something's wrong. Something's definitely wrong. Oh shit, it's coming for me. Oh no. It's just that impending doom really hits here, and it works so well.
Yeah, We Carry On is really kind of the start of a string of songs that I consider my favorites. I think this is a very kind of bottom-heavy album in terms of the songs I really enjoy. And We Carry On it definitely starts that off on a good foot. You got this kind of pounding, almost tribal, I guess maybe jungle drums going on. You got this simple electronic melody that kind of runs through. And it's really a song where I think the music does as much to convey the tone as Beth Gibbons' voice. It's very frantic song. It really kind of gets your blood pumping.
Well, the other nice thing here, too, is that you have that sort of post-punk guitar in there, that sort of Joy Division-esque guitar comes in about halfway through, and then it sort of settles back down, and then it reappears. But it works so well. Again, it's weaving all these threads. I mean, you had mentioned that, sort of the evolution of this sound, of this anxiousness. It's interesting. At certain points, you hear it, right? Like, you hear individual threads from different parts of the history of this kind of thing. It's fascinating. It's a completely interesting way to look at it.
Musically, I think it's very simple song. At least much of the beginning is. It's really just kind of the drums and the electronic beat, but it gets you anxious. Like, its beat just kind of naturally raises your heart rate a little bit. Just listening to it either gets you anxious or kind of like puts you in like, yeah, I'm going to like kind of headbang to this song. This is the song you put on. It's like the first song where it's like, you can see where trip-hop kind of sprang from house music. I think it's a song that you would hear at a club. It's something you'd put on and you have the rave lights going on.
Yeah, that's a great point. From there, the most interesting track to me, Deep Water. This is a fascinating track to me. It's basically Gibbons' voice in a ukulele. My initial reaction to hearing this is I thought it was a pessimistic song. I thought it was arguably the most pessimistic song because there's sort of like this try not to struggle at one point is what Beth Gibbons says. Try not to struggle, don't fight it. But you mentioned something to me. I didn't hear this part of the lyric. There's this after the don't struggle, don't fight it. It's like things will turn around, things will get better, which is probably honestly the most uplifting song on the album. So it's a fascinating juxtaposition. It's only a minute and a half long, but it really stands out and it's completely enjoyable.
You'd think that for a modern music audience, you'd probably get sick of hearing girls singing over a ukulele, but 2008, that was probably like, that was new and hip. Like,
they started
girls
this
singing
trend.
over ukuleles? Like, what was this, Don Henley? But there's like this kind of strange message of whether you could view it as kind of a suicidal or a kind of living in spite of suicidal thing. But
it's either uplifting, it's either wonderfully uplifting or devastatingly crushing. And I kind of like that I didn't know when I first heard it which it was.
There's a couple of touches on here. I mean, you got Beth Gibbons obviously singing. You also have David Poore and Ben Salisbury labeled as the Summerfield Workers Choir doing a kind of barbershop quartet kind of accompaniment on the chorus here. Yeah.
But it's so deadpan. That's the other thing that's so great.
It almost reminds me of like a Ween song.
It does. That's a great way.
Here. Very interesting. According to the recording notes on here, that Deep Water was inspired by Steve Martin's performance of Tonight You Belong to Me in the 1979 film The Jerk.
Wow. That's interesting.
Yeah, I mean, Steve Martin, I think it's kind of like come out lately that he's kind of like this very bluegrass obsessive kind of guy. So I could see Steve Martin performing this song almost. But, apparently this song was a design of Jeff Barrow. Apparently Adrian Utley, who performs electronic guitar, acoustic guitar and such on this record, was apparently not all that impressed with it, so much that he didn't want any part of it. But apparently, as the years passed, they've kind of switched views on it. So now Adrian really likes this song, and Jeff Barrow's like, I don't really like it, But, in terms of the album itself, it doesn't sound like anything else on the record.
And yet it still fits. Like, it hits you like a welcome reprieve until you think, maybe this is terrible. Not that the song's terrible, but the feeling, has gotten so overwhelming.
And interestingly, I mean, it's kind of like, if you look at it through the kind of the track listing, it kind of acts as, if you remember the old kind of thing about the Pixies, where their kind of songwriting technique was loud, quiet, loud. And you start off with We Carry On, track 6. You got kind of this quiet song with Deep Water, kind of just girl ukulele. And then the next track, Machine Gun, is probably the loudest song on the record.
Yeah, this is a great track. This is one of my absolute favorites. I can't remember where exactly, but I heard them play this live in 2008 when the album came out, and that drum sound, it hits so hard and it warbles. There's this bass, this extremely low bass that just like also comes along with the drum, and it's just all encompassing. I always thought this would make a great song for sporting events on like third down when you're trying to when the opponent's offense has the ball and it's third down and you need a defensive stop. If you played these loud drums, it's imposing. It sounds like you're in trouble. I mean, but it's still somehow uplifting, and I could see crowds sort of like it's a weird thing going on there.
Yeah, according to the recording notes, the drum machine that you hear in Machine Gun was sampled through an old electronic organ. Kind of speaks to why electronic music can be so popular nowadays, is that there's just so much kind of creative things that you can do with music now. You can sample things through anything nowadays. You can add different filters and such. Opening up this song is another one of those songs that is really kind of reminiscent of the old electronic music scene, especially industrial bands like Nine Inch Nails, circa Pretty Hate Machine, Ministry. Kind of these harsh electronic bands sound like they recorded what a steel factory has nightmares about at the beginning, and then by the end of the song it's kind of lightened up to something that kind of resembles more 80s music, really. Kind of the works of John Carpenter.
Yeah, John Carpenter. You mentioned Terminator too, the Terminator soundtrack, which is dead on. I actually think I think Carpenter and the Terminator soundtrack are dead on. Like, that is what that sounds like, and it's somehow, I don't even know how you would begin to describe it. It's sort of just a very high rising synth that's still scary, imposing in some way. For Machine Gun, we go on to the track Small, another one that starts off nice and quiet and then sort of explodes a little bit there at the end. Gibbons' voice is sort of the central theme. What are your thoughts on the track?
This is another one of those tracks that I very much enjoy. It's a song that also, I think, much like Hunter, way back on track 2, kind of starts off simply. In Small's case, it's a very kind of somber thing. You have Beth Gibbons singing. You have like this cello, which is very kind of seems strange to me, because the way that they hold the notes on this cello almost seems like unnaturally long. They just make it persist for so long. And then like the bottom drops out and you like get to this, I guess it would be a bridge, pounding like psychedelic groove just going on, just rocking out. And it might be my favorite song on the record. We Carry On is up there, but I just really love the way that transition goes. Long, sustained cello note, and then just suddenly just collapses into this psychedelic music.
Yeah, the psychedelic garage kind of thing going on there when it finally collapses is hypnotic in its own way.
Yeah, just really good song, and then just like it's over and it's like back to the cello, just like a moment of life kicking up through the snow.
From there we move on to Magic Doors, the next to last track on the album. This one, I think it's just a good continuation. I find this might arguably be the weakest track on the album, but again, it continues sort of the general theme, and again, Gibbons saying, I can't deny what I've become, I'm just emotionally numb. She's just dwelling in that near depression, that sort of state. And I think that, again, the music just reflects that perfectly here.
According to the kind of production notes, Magic Doors was the first song that Jeff Barrow and Adrian Utley worked on. It was kind of the catalyst for the album even being made, actually. So you kind of got to give it props for kind of kicking off the recording process. But, strangely enough, although I really like pretty much every song on the second half of this album, Magic Doors, it honestly doesn't really hit me as hard as those other songs do. It's the song that is most reminiscent of what I expect kind of this trip-hop sound to be. You got some of Beth, you got some like violins kind of wailing on, but honestly it's kind of like there's not really anything that kind of blows me away like the other tracks do.
I think from there, the last track, Threads, I think this is a great closer. It's that slow build that just keeps going. I mean, that just sort of that same thing that Small does, sort of that same thing that Hunter does, where you've got Gibbons' voice, you've got a guitar, or you've got something playing low, and it's building up until this sort of explosion, until the explosion's too strong of a word, but to this crescendo that is sort of terrifying in its own way.
I mean, I think I enjoy albums where the end song is like this big sweeping thing. Like I like albums that kind of like, we're going to end on a high note, if possible. Black Star did it with I Can't Give Everything Away. Dirty Mind did it with Party Up.
Party Up, that's it, yes.
Which was kind of like this weird kind of political protest song combined with
a mishmash, yeah.
Threads follows with that mindset that it's kind of this doom metal song. It just lumbers about and just pounds your eardrums.
There's almost like a tea kettle, too, in the background. There's almost like this high-pitched sort of that sets the tone. It doesn't take much. That's what's fascinating, I think, about Portishead is you sort of dissect what instruments there are, what you're hearing. There's not a whole bunch of layering. It's just really smartly done. It's just really well done. And Gibbons' voice can, 2 or 3 instruments on its own, it feels like sometimes. It adds not only lyrically, but tone.
It is really kind of like a Black Sabbath song in that it's just kind of, the power is not in the technical proficiency. It is just kind of assault with sound and kind of this, and Beth Gibbons kind of streaking into the heavens almost with her voice, much like Ozzy Osbourne would do. It's just like a very powerful, dark song in a lot of ways.
That closes the album. To me, what fascinates me about this album, it's something I don't want to beat like a dead horse, but anymore, it's very hard to find these albums that are alternative rock, that are catchy, that are rhythmic, that are also really built in sort of a anxious, nervous, frightening state. You don't hear a lot of them. They don't tend to be anywhere near this good. And that's why, I think Radiohead's OK Computer gets a lot of so many accolades. This album also does that same thing, and also it conveys itself so well. I think it's sort of it's one of those albums that if you like, if you're depressed and you actually like to sort of play that out, this is a great album for that. If you're depressed, you listen to this and it's cathartic. It sort of works out those emotions, and then you experience them, and then you're over it. And so I think I hope that's where Beth is coming from there. I think that these lyrics and sort of this album, it fits that bill, and it's a wonderful cathartic release.
I mean, yeah, I can't really think of too many bands that kind of capture this kind of sound of anxiety, gloomy, wintry depression. Anthony and the Johnsons kind of did that for me a couple years ago. It's kind of really kind of a sign of the progression of songwriting and music that you kind of can really speak about negative thoughts and kind of dark thoughts in that way. A lot of people will be against that. They'll kind of say that, we talked about it prior to recording, kind of this idea that if someone is depressed, then you try to cheer them up, you try to say, hey, play something happy. That can sometimes help. Sometimes that's what you need to kind of pull yourself out of it. But, depression is something that really kind of doesn't really have a set pattern, doesn't really have like a certain trigger that can just automatically get you in and out of it. Sometimes it's also good to know that you are not alone. I think it's a very important thing. That if you kind of feel that you're miserable and the world kind of sucks, I think it's often helpful to get the feeling that you're not the only one who feels depressed or feels like the world is kind of sucky, or that you kind of are unattractive and everything else. I think that as much as like happy music, I think dwelling sometimes in sad music, anxious music can also kind of help that, because it's a way of release, of catharsis, of kind of like building the emotions up to a point and then just kind of breaking, and then you can just kind of leave the emotions with that song. I mean, we use music for a lot of things. I know sometimes when I feel angry, I'll listen to the Dicks or Replacements or something like that to kind of give me, if I want to feel happy or if I want to feel, sad. It's feeling sad is just as important as kind of feeling happy. I think it's just as healthy to kind of be able to release kind of those negative, sad feelings through music, instead of bottling it up and having them kind of come out in other directions. We were talking about it before over whether or not the me back then, who had kind of only heard of Portishead through Corky and the Juice Space and never kind of went back to it, whether or not I went for it, kind of been interested in it. And, I think honestly I probably would. It's as someone who was kind of felt like an outsider, who kind of didn't really fit in to that degree. I think it was music like Primus and Nick Cave and the Bad Seeds, kind of the music that I was into but no one else was into. Kind of this, I think this music not only would kind of had helped me know that there were people who also had these kind of negative emotions, but it would have probably been a band that would have felt like my band, I think. I think I would have liked Portishead's Third as much, or maybe even more so, back in 2008 than I would have now, because I really did enjoy this album. I think I can kind of appreciate it for the elements of modern music that I can see that it inspired.
It's a great album. It's one that I'm so glad that we covered. It has the distinction of being the first band that we've covered, which is interesting, and we were not cognizant of when we made that decision. Jacob, thanks as always for joining me. Everyone, thanks for listening. Remember that you can reach us on Twitter @albumsonly. You can also email us with comments or suggestions at albumsonlypodcast@gmail.com. We're going to be back next time. We're going to be talking about, we sort of hinted that we were going to be talking about some underrated albums or underappreciated albums. This ain't going to be one of them. We're going to talk about the Beach Boys and Pet Sounds, an album that has so much that you can talk about, so many instruments. It's such a wonderful creation. I'm looking forward to it, and we're going to cover it next time.